The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota prairie like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, no soft blanket of snow laid over a sleeping land. It was a sudden, violent assault. The wind, born in the barren Arctic, screamed across the plains with nothing to slow it, nothing to break its stride. It was a wind that carried the cold like a physical weapon, a cold that did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs of the settlers' cabins, found its way through the mud chinking, and breathed its icy breath down the collars of the stoutest men. It was a cold that stole the heat from a roaring fire before it could even reach the far corners of a room. For the small settlement of Providence, huddled on a shallow bend of a frozen creek, the cold was more than an adversary. It was a siege engine. The primary currency of survival was wood, and the prairie was a miser. The thin stands of cottonwood and ash along the creek were a precious and dwindling resource. Every log was a victory, every cord a fortune. A man's wealth that winter was not measured in acres or coin, but in the height and breadth of his woodpile. And every woodpile, no matter how grand it looked in the crisp sun of November, was shrinking with terrifying speed. The standard cabins, built with the hard-won knowledge of forested lands back east, proved to be porous fortresses against this new kind of enemy. They were built of thick logs, notched and fitted with pride. But the wind, thin and sharp like a knife, found every invisible seam. Inside, life became a shrinking circle around the cast-iron stove. Families ate there, slept there, and watched the frost creep like a living vine up the interior walls, sometimes just feet from the fire itself. The stoves devoured wood with a ravenous appetite, turning seasoned oak into gray ash in a desperate, losing battle against the boundless cold. The community struggled as one. Thomas Allen, a man with 3 sons, all strong as oxen, had spent his autumn hauling wood until his pile was the envy of the settlement. By January, he was confessing to his neighbor that he was burning through it twice as fast as he had planned. His wife kept a pot of water on the stove, not for coffee, but so the steam might fight the terrible dryness of the air, a dryness that cracked skin and splintered wood. Even Silas Croft, the town's founder and most respected builder, a man whose cabin was considered a masterpiece of frontier engineering, felt the cold gnawing at the edges of his confidence. He would stand by his window, watching the snow drift into dunes that buried his fences, and feel a deep, unsettling fear. The methods they had always trusted were failing them. The prairie was a different beast, and it was devouring their traditions along with their firewood. It was in this climate of shared hardship and growing fear that the settlement began to notice the strange activities of the widow, Elara Vance. She was an outsider, having arrived only the previous spring with her 2 small children, a boy named Leo and a girl named Clara. Her husband had succumbed to a fever on the trail west, leaving her with little more than a strong back, a quiet demeanor, and a parcel of land nobody else had wanted, set a little apart from the main cluster of cabins. She was seen as a tragic figure, a subject of pity and quiet concern. Her cabin was smaller than the others, and her woodpile was alarmingly, almost foolishly, small. Elara's knowledge came not from the forested hills of Ohio or Pennsylvania, but from the wind-swept plains of a distant land across the sea. She had grown up in a place where trees were a luxury, where generations had learned to draw warmth from the leavings of the earth. She had watched her grandmother manage a fire with peat, with dried dung, with anything that would burn. She carried this knowledge not as a collection of facts, but as a deep, ingrained instinct for thermal efficiency, a sense of how heat was born, how it moved, and, most importantly, how it could be held. She saw the men of Providence fighting the cold with brute force, throwing log after log into hungry stoves, and she knew it was a war they could not win. Her idea was born of this old knowledge and the new reality of her surroundings. After the autumn corn harvest, the fields were littered with cobs. To the other settlers, they were useless refuse. They were kicked aside, burned in piles in the fields to be rid of them, or used as bedding for livestock. The thought of using them for fuel was absurd. A corn cob was light and airy. It would flare up and be gone in a minute, a puff of heat that would do nothing to fight a Dakota winter. It was children's kindling, not a serious fuel. When Silas Croft rode out to check on the widow in late autumn, as was his custom for the more vulnerable members of his flock, he found her not splitting logs, but gathering corn cobs. She and her children were moving methodically through the harvested fields, their burlap sacks growing fat with the discarded husks of the season's bounty. He reined in his horse, his brow furrowed with a mixture of pity and confusion. "Mistress Vance?" he called out, his voice carrying on the crisp air. "That's a poor substitute for oak. Your fire will eat 100 of those before you've even warmed your hands." Ilara looked up, her face calm. She shielded her eyes from the low sun. "It is what I have, Mr. Croft," she said simply. Her answer was not an argument, nor a plea for help. It was a statement of fact. Silas sighed, a plume of white vapor leaving his lips. He was a good man, a proud man, and he felt a responsibility for this woman. "There's still time," he advised, his tone shifting from confusion to paternal authority. "My boys and I can help you drag some timber from the South Creek. It's a long haul, but it's proper firewood. What you're doing here, it's a waste of your energy. You and these little ones will freeze before the new year if you trust your lives to that." She gave a small, polite nod. "Thank you for the offer, sir, but I must attend to my own preparations." The exchange was repeated in different forms with others. Martha Allen, bringing a small loaf of bread, saw the sacks of cobs and clucked her tongue. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "Don't you worry. My Thomas will bring you a proper load of wood before the first big snow. You can't be burning trash." The laughter started soon after. It was not cruel, not at first. It was the easy, knowing laughter of experienced people observing the folly of a novice. The men would talk over their mugs at the small, makeshift trading post. "Heard the widow is laying in a winter's supply of cobs," one would say, and the others would chuckle. "She'll learn," was the common refrain. "The prairie teaches everyone the same lessons." They saw her small woodpile and her large pile of cobs, and they shook their heads, certain of the tragedy to come. She was a dreamer, a fool, a woman who did not understand the brutal arithmetic of their world. Ilara heard the whispers. She saw the pitying glances and the smirks the men tried to hide behind their hands. It isolated her, wrapping her in a cloak of gentle ostracism. But it did not deter her. She did not have the energy for pride or indignation. All her energy was focused on the work, a meticulous and patient campaign against the coming cold. While the other settlers focused on the single task of accumulating wood, Ilara's work was a system, a series of interconnected preparations, each one as important as the last. Her first task had been the gathering. For weeks, she and the children had walked the harvested fields. She taught them to choose only the driest, hardest cobs, the ones that had been bleached by the sun. They left the damp, moldy ones behind. It was slow, back-breaking work. They filled dozens of burlap sacks, dragging them one by one back to their small cabin, until a mound of them stood beside her door, a mound that grew larger than her meager woodpile. This was the sight that caused so much amusement and head-shaking in the community. Next came the drying. This was a crucial step, one that nobody else understood. She didn't just pile the cobs. She built long, narrow racks against the south-facing wall of her cabin. The racks were made of scavenged wood and twine, designed to hold the cobs in single layers, exposed to the sun and the dry prairie wind. Every morning she would lay them out, and every evening before the dew could settle, she and the children would gather them back into the sacks and store them in their small, dry shed. She was curing them, driving out the last vestiges of moisture, making them not just flammable, but potent. While the cobs cured, she turned her attention to the cabin itself. She knew that the most powerful fire was useless if the heat it produced could escape. She became a student of her small home, learning its weaknesses. She spent days running her bare hands along the seams between the logs, feeling for the slightest whisper of moving air. Where the chinking had cracked, she did not just patch it. She made a new mixture of clay from the creek bed, tough prairie grass, and hog bristles, creating a compound that was both adhesive and flexible. She pressed it into every crack, not just on the inside, but on the outside as well, creating a seal that was nearly airtight. She stuffed old rags and dried moss into the gaps around the single window frame and the door. Her cabin was small, but she would make it a fortress. The centerpiece of her entire system, however, was the stove. It was a standard, small, cast-iron box stove, the kind common in the territory. It was designed to burn wood, and to burn it quickly. It was notoriously inefficient, radiating heat intensely from its sides, but letting most of the warmth rush up the stovepipe along with the smoke. The other settlers simply fed these iron beasts more and more wood. Ilara knew she had to tame it. She began by building a shell around it, using flat stones she had gathered from the creek bed, and more of her clay and grass mortar. She painstakingly constructed a second wall around the back and sides of the iron stove, leaving a small air gap of about an inch between the iron and the stone. This stone shell was not beautiful, but it was functional. It was designed to capture the fierce, immediate heat from the iron box and hold it, turning it into a mass of thermal energy that would then radiate warmth slowly and evenly into the room, long after the fire within had died down. It was a rudimentary masonry heater, a concept utterly foreign to her neighbors. Then she modified the firebox itself. She lined the bottom and sides with a layer of fire brick she had traded for a dozen of her chickens. This lining protected the iron from the intense, focused heat the cobs would produce, and further contributed to the thermal mass. Finally, she created a simple baffle for the stovepipe, a small, sliding piece of sheet metal that allowed her to control the draft. By closing it partially, she could slow the escape of hot air, forcing it to linger in the stove and the stone shell, surrendering more of its heat to the room before it was allowed to leave. While she worked, the life of the settlement went on around her, a constant, unintentional commentary on her divergence from the norm. She would hear the thud of Thomas Allen's axe from dawn until dusk as he sacrificed his remaining logs, splitting them smaller and smaller to make them last. She saw Silas Croft, his face grim, organizing a party of men for a dangerous, multi-day trip to a distant bluff rumored to have a stand of unclaimed oak, a desperate gamble against the encroaching winter. They were all working hard, with a frantic, forceful energy. Her work was different. It was quiet, precise, and patient. They were gathering fuel. She was building an engine. They were fighting a war of attrition. She was practicing a science of conservation. Her isolation was complete, but it was an isolation born of focus, not of loneliness. Her children, too young to understand the town's skepticism, saw only the purpose in their mother's hands and worked alongside her, their small tasks essential parts of the larger design. The great storm arrived in the second week of January. It did not announce itself with gray skies and gentle flurries. It appeared on the northwestern horizon as a low, bruised purple wall of cloud that seemed to swallow the light. The wind fell utterly silent for an hour, an eerie, breathless calm that put every animal on edge. Then the front hit. It was not a snowfall. It was a horizontal blizzard, a solid wall of white that erased the world. The wind returned with a demonic fury, shrieking like a predator, and the temperature plummeted as if the bottom had fallen out of the sky. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world ceased to exist outside the walls of the cabins. The wind was a physical force, a constant, violent pressure that made the sturdy log structures groan and shudder. It drove the snow, as fine and sharp as sand, into every microscopic crevice. The cold was a presence, an active, invading entity. Inside the cabin of Silas Croft, the temperature dropped to a point where a bucket of water placed 10 feet from the stove developed a skin of ice. He and his wife fed their magnificent fireplace and their iron stove constantly, yet the heat seemed to be sucked out of the room as fast as it was produced. The logs of seasoned oak, which should have burned for hours, were consumed in a fraction of the time, their heat stolen by the gale roaring down the chimney. Silas, the master builder, could only watch as the frost climbed his walls and the faces of his family grew pinched and pale. His woodpile, once a symbol of security, was melting away like snow in the sun. In the Allen cabin, the situation was worse. They ran out of split logs on the second day. Thomas, in a desperate act, began to break apart a wooden crate, then the chair his grandfather had made. His wife and sons huddled together under a mountain of blankets, their breath pluming in the frigid air of their own home. The fire was a small, pathetic thing in the center of a vast and conquering cold. They were not living in their home. They were surviving in a makeshift tent of blankets, prisoners in a cabin that had become a cage of ice. The traditional methods, the thick logs and the roaring fires, had failed. They were a testament to the brute force of men, but the prairie's cold was a force of nature, and it was winning. Inside Elara Vance's small cabin, the storm was a different experience. The wind howled and screamed outside, shaking the little structure, but the sound was muffled, distant. The walls, sealed with her meticulous care, did not surrender to the assault. There were no drafts, no thin streams of icy air snaking across the floor. The cabin was a sealed vessel in a turbulent sea. And in the center of the room, the modified stove was the calm, beating heart of her creation. It did not roar. It did not rage. It glowed with a steady, deep red warmth. Every hour or so, Elara would open the small iron door, and the light would illuminate her calm face. She would add not a heaping armload, but just a few of the specially dried corn cobs. They caught instantly, burning with a clean, intense, white-hot flame. She would then close the door and adjust the damper, slowing the airflow until the fire settled into a steady, efficient burn. The iron box heated quickly, and its heat was immediately absorbed by the surrounding shell of stone and fire brick. That shell, now a solid mass of stored energy, radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth throughout the small, single room. Her children were not huddled in fear. Leo was on the floor, tracing patterns on a slate. Clara was asleep in her small bed, covered by a single quilt. The air was not hot, but it was comfortable. It was an even, constant warmth that filled the entire space, a warmth you could breathe. Elara sat in her rocking chair, mending a sock, her movements calm and unhurried. She was not fighting the storm. She was coexisting with it, protected by a system born of observation, humility, and old, forgotten wisdom. Her pile of cured cobs, which had seemed so foolishly large, was now her assurance of survival. It was an arsenal of small, potent suns, and she was using them with the precision of a general, winning her battle not with volume, but with strategy. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally died. The silence it left behind was as profound as the noise had been. The sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white, beautiful and terrifying. The settlement of Providence emerged from its shelters slowly, like creatures from hibernation. The people were pale, exhausted, and bone-cold. The first and most immediate crisis was fuel. Woodpiles were either gone or reduced to a few pathetic logs. The communal sense of security had been shattered. Silas Croft's first thought, after assuring himself of his own family's welfare, was for the widow. A grim certainty settled in his stomach. If he, in his sturdy, well-stocked home, had barely weathered the storm, she and her children, with their pile of trash fuel, surely had not. He felt a pang of guilt, a heavy sense of responsibility. He should have forced her to take the wood. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots and began the arduous trek through the massive drifts toward her cabin, expecting to find a house of ice, a tragic silence within. The journey was short in distance but long in effort. The snow was waist-deep, and the air was so cold it burned his lungs. As he neared her small cabin, he saw no smoke from the chimney, and his heart sank. He had been right. It was a fool's hope. He pushed through the last drift to her door, his mind rehearsing the terrible discovery he was about to make. He raised a heavy, gloved fist and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. He expected no answer. The door opened. Ilara Vance stood there, holding a half-mended shirt. She did not look distressed or frozen. Her cheeks had color. Behind her, in the cabin, he could see her son playing on the floor. And then he felt it. It was not a blast of heat like the one from his own overworked stove. It was a wave of calm, gentle, pervasive warmth that washed over his frozen face. It was the most shocking sensation he had ever felt. He stood there, speechless, his mouth slightly agape. He stared past her into the room. It was not just warm, it was normal. There was no frost on the walls. The air was still. The two children were dressed in simple clothes, not bundled in layers of wool. His eyes fell upon the strange-looking stove, a hybrid of iron and stone, from which a quiet, steady heat seemed to emanate. Beside it sat a simple wicker basket, filled with corn cobs. "Mr. Croft," Ilara said, her voice even, "are you well? You look frozen through." Silas could not form a sentence. He could only stumble forward, into the warmth, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with what he knew to be true. The interior of the cabin was a comfortable 60 degrees, perhaps more. His own home, with a fire still burning, was barely above freezing. He looked at the stove, at the basket of cobs, at the children, at Ilara's calm face. He was wrong. It was not just a simple statement. It was a profound, world-altering revelation. He, Silas Croft, the expert, the founder, the man everyone looked to for guidance, was fundamentally, completely, and dangerously wrong. He finally found his voice, a rough, humbled whisper. "How?" Ilara did not boast. She did not say, "I told you so." There was no hint of triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, matter-of-fact compassion. She gestured to a simple wooden chair near the stove. "Please," she said, "sit and get warm. I will put on water for coffee." It was a simple act of hospitality, but in that moment it felt like an act of profound grace. As he sat, feeling the steady, radiant heat seep into his frozen bones, she began to explain. She spoke of the dry cobs, the sealed walls, the stone shell that held the heat like a reservoir, and the damper that kept it from escaping. She spoke not of magic, but of principles, of thermal mass and controlled combustion. It was the language of a science he had never known existed. He was a builder of boxes, she was a builder of warmth. Word spreads fast in a small community, but the news of Ilara's warm cabin spread like a wildfire. Silas did not try to hide what he had found. He went back to the settlement, his face a mask of awe and humility. and he told Thomas Allen first. "You won't believe it, Thomas. It's warm. Her cabin is warm." The initial reaction was disbelief, but Silas's reputation was unassailable. If he said it was so, it was so. Curiosity quickly overcame skepticism. Thomas Allen was the next to make the trek, and he returned with the same look of stunned reverence. Then came others, in twos and threes. They would arrive, shivering, their faces etched with the hardship of the last few days, and they would step across her threshold into a world that should not have been possible. They stood in stunned silence, feeling the gentle heat on their faces, watching her children play as if it were a mild autumn day. The object of their ridicule had become a source of miracles. The laughter was gone, replaced by a deep, resounding silence of respect. The whispers of "the foolish widow" were replaced with whispers of "the warm cabin." The true turning point came the next day. Silas Croft returned, but not just to marvel. He held his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor before he looked up to meet her eyes. His pride, a thing as solid and old as the prairie itself, had been broken by the undeniable truth of her success. "Mistress Vance," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I was a fool, a proud, ignorant fool. I spoke from a place of arrogance, and I put you and your family in my mind for ruin. But I was wrong." He took a deep breath. "What you have done here, it is more than just a trick. It is wisdom. I am asking you, will you teach me?" It was a moment that would become legend in the settlement. The most respected man, the leader, humbling himself before the quiet outsider. Elara simply nodded. There was no negotiation, no demand for apology or payment. The knowledge was for survival, and survival was a communal need. "Of course, Mr. Croft," she said. "I will show you." And so, the lessons began. She did not just give them instructions, she shared the principles behind them. She took Silas and the other men to her shed and showed them the cured cobs, explaining why the lack of moisture was so critical. She had them run their hands along the sealed walls of her cabin, teaching them how to find and plug the smallest leaks that stole their warmth. Most importantly, she showed them the stove. With her children watching, she explained the concept of the air gap, the importance of the stone's mass, the function of the damper. She taught them that the goal was not a big, roaring fire, but a small, hot, slow one. The heat, she explained, was a resource to be captured and stored, not just produced and spent. They listened with the rapt attention of schoolchildren. These were practical men, skilled with their hands, and they understood the simple, elegant genius of what she had created. They saw how their own methods had been wasteful, how they had been trying to fill a leaky bucket with an open fire hose. She was teaching them how to patch the bucket and use a gentle spring. She shared her knowledge freely, patiently answering every question, her hands demonstrating the techniques for mixing the mortar, for laying the stones. She held nothing back. In the space of a few days, the community's social structure had been inverted. The quiet widow, the object of pity, had become its most vital teacher, its source of hope. When spring finally broke, melting the great drifts and revealing the green promise of the prairie underneath, the settlement of Providence was not the same. The experience of the great storm had been a crucible, burning away old prides and forging new bonds of humility and respect. The sound of that summer was not just the sound of planting and mending fences, it was the sound of rebuilding. Guided by Elara, with Silas Croft as her most diligent and enthusiastic foreman, the men began to modify their homes. They gathered stones from the creek, mixed clay and grass, and retrofitted their iron stoves with thermal shells. They spent days sealing their cabins, searching for drafts with a newfound obsession. The women and children, meanwhile, were tasked with a new annual chore, the gathering, curing, and storing of corn cobs. Sheds that once held only firewood now had large bins dedicated to the new fuel. The physical landscape of the settlement began to change. The towering, prideful woodpiles of previous years were smaller, more modest, and they were now always accompanied by a shed filled with the humble, potent cobs. The idea, like a prairie seed on the wind, began to spread. A traveler, staying the night in Providence the following winter, marveled at the comfortable warmth of the trading post, heated by a stone-encased stove that glowed quietly and consumed a basket of cobs. He took the story with him to the next settlement and the next. A land surveyor, charting new territory, noted the unique prairie stoves in his official report, describing their efficiency and the unusual fuel source. The story of the widow who survived the great blizzard by burning corn waste became a piece of frontier lore, a quiet movement of practical wisdom spreading across the plains. It was an innovation born not in a fancy workshop or a university, but in the mind of a quiet woman who paid attention, who remembered the old ways, and who was not afraid to defy the loud certainty of the crowd. Years later, when the settlement of Providence had grown into a proper town, with a church and a school, the story was still told. It was told to children as a lesson in not judging others, and to newcomers as an explanation for their peculiar but effective stoves. Ilara Vance never sought credit or praise. She lived out her days quietly, a respected elder in the community she had saved. Her legacy was not a monument of stone or brass, but something far more vital. It was written in the warm, safe homes of her neighbors, in the faces of children who no longer had to fear the winter's wind. The great and terrible prairie had taught them all its lesson, but it was the quiet widow who had translated it for them. They had learned that the loudest voice is not always the wisest, and that sometimes the most profound solutions are found not in doing more, but in understanding more. Survival, they finally understood, was not a matter of strength, but of ingenuity. And true wisdom was often found in the humble act of listening. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom, share it with someone who believes in looking for answers in unexpected places. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and ingenuity.